and our Amen. Well, I just want to let you know, first of all, that I always try to find backgrounds from somewhere in the history of art. This is not that. Apparently, very few artists have decided to paint the manna scene. So here we are with a little more childlike image. Traveling through the wilderness after escaping from slavery in Egypt, the Israelites began complaining to their leaders, Moses and Aaron. The Israelites cried out, "If only we had died in Egypt. At least we had food to eat there. But you have brought us out into the wilderness where we will surely all die from hunger." The Israelites' complaints in the book of Exodus were quite serious and quite sincere. They were hungry and afraid and frustrated. They weren't sure if or how they were ever going to get to the promised land. But in spite of their very real and precarious predicament, their complaints also end up sounding a little bit whiny to my ear. Indeed, it can be hard not to picture the complaining Israelites as children who simply do not want to finish a long hike on which their parents have coerced their participation. Imagine the Israelites trudging behind Moses and Aaron, petulant and miserable. They want to sit down and cry, but they don't even have the energy to change their bodily position in protest. So they just keep dragging themselves forward at the slowest possible pace. I don't mean to make too much light of the trials that the Israelites faced in the wilderness, but it's hard to know how to properly react to behavior that sometimes seems a bit childish. This isn't the first time on their journey that the Israelites had raised their voices in complaint. Indeed, just a few chapters earlier, as they realized that the Egyptians were following them in hot pursuit, the Israelites complained to Moses, saying, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." But Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only be still." The Israelites complain and grumble. Moses answers, and God acts, enabling the Israelites to pass through the Red Sea and to safety on the other shore. They have not reached the promised land, of course, but they have at least evaded the significant threat of a return to Egyptian captivity, or possibly even of death. And they do take a moment to celebrate, but only really a moment. For no sooner had they crossed to the other side when they begin to face new difficulties and again raise their voices in complaint. After coming through the sea, for 3 days, the Israelites traveled in the desert without finding water. When they came to a place called Marah, they could not drink the water because it was bitter. So they complained, and Moses took their complaint to God, and God showed Moses how to sweeten the water for them. Next, of course, we come to the selfsame episode that we heard recounted this morning by Emmy. The Israelites are hungry, and hunger is surely an understandable thing to complain about. Moses speaks with God, and God decides to send quail to the Israelites every evening and manna every morning. The people are told to take only as much as they need for that day, as God would provide fresh food each morning and each evening. Now, as you could surely have predicted, some people took more than they needed, and I'll admit to likely being one of the people who would have put a little surplus manna in my pocket. at least until the next morning, when those who had taken extra discovered their day-old manna filled with maggots and emitting a rotten odor. Never again. But what are we to make of this story, we modern listeners who are well trained in skepticism? First, God does not seem to provide for the Israelites automatically, but only in response to the Israelites expressing their needs, in response to their complaining and their grumbling. For most of us, a tendency to complain isn't considered a very commendable personality trait. But for the Israelites in the Exodus narrative, complaining was a way of getting God's attention, a way of letting God know what they needed. Imagine how differently we'd read this text if we substituted the word advocated for the word complained. The Israelites advocated for themselves in the wilderness. They advocated for safety, for water, for food. And yes, they employed a good deal of hyperbole. But when speaking with the God of the universe, hyperbole sometimes feels like an appropriate dialect, doesn't it? Now, here's the other important thing in this story, I think. The whole point of this story, for most Christian readers, is as an elucidation of the truism of faith that God provides. God provides new manna each morning. No need to hoard, no need to worry. God will provide. Now, I have to say that the idea that God provides is something I've wrestled with for most of my life. Because in a great many of my own life circumstances, God has not, in any obvious way, seemed to provide. And when I look out at the wider world and consider the desperate plight of so many people, well, I can't always see God's clear provision there either. And yet people of faith down through the centuries have affirmed again and again that they experience God as a God who provides. Which can lead me to wonder if I'm somehow missing the boat. What do other people experience that I don't? Who is this God who provides? This God who is so utterly dependable? This God who can transform struggle and strife into joy? What am I missing? When I go back to our text from Exodus, I'm reminded that before God provides, the Israelites first made plaintive requests to God. And how often do we declare what we need? How often do we spend time getting really clear about what would make a genuine difference in our lives, and then advocating to high heaven on our own behalf? Not very often, at least in my case. Most of us tend to be a little more passive in our spiritual lives. We tend to wait for an abstract sense of fulfillment or peace to descend upon us, rather than taking the risk of complaining to God about the challenging predicaments in which we find ourselves and asking God to help us. Not so the Israelites. They lay into God, demanding a response. Indeed, one Jewish commentary on this passage suggests that what matters most is not whether there is enough water to drink or meat to cook, but whether the struggle to be free is indeed the will of God. Is there an addressee for our complaints, a someone to hear our cries, a partner to our dialogue? Is there an addressee for our complaints, a someone to hear our cries, a partner to our dialogue? Perhaps this is our deepest question too. Perhaps what we are most yearning for, what would most feel like God providing for us, would be a far more active sense of God's engagement, God's involvement, God's participation in these complex human lives that we are living. But God's involvement seems to necessitate our involvement. Yet still we hold back so often. We don't shout our complaints heavenward. Maybe we're afraid. Maybe we're afraid that God won't provide. Or maybe we're afraid that God will. Either way, maybe it's worth the risk. May it be so. Amen.